Good day. Today is Monday, 2nd February 2026. And before I proceed with this program, let me remind you again to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. If once you've heard the video and you like what you've heard and you wish to indicate that fact. Now, over the last few hours, we've had comments from Iran saying that President Pezeshkian of Iran, obviously with the agreement of Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei, have authorized a negotiating party to meet with the United States to discuss various issues, presumably in Oman. There's no confirmation of this, there's no formal confirmation of this, but the reports are circulating in the Iranian media, and there's reports also that it has been confirmed informally to the the semi-official Tasnim news agency. Who will be representing the Iranian government? We're not yet told. Most likely it will be the Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi, who will be representing the United States. We don't know either. In the past, it has been Steve Witkoff. The Iranians were furious and very upset when the United States used negotiations in June between Witkoff and Araghchi in Oman in order to basically place them in a state of complacency, even as the US's ally Israel prepared for an attack against Iran. The Iranians are making very clear that they're not going to fall for that particular trick again. But whether these negotiations are going to achieve anything, what exactly is going to be discussed over the course of these negotiations, at this time, it's difficult to say. Nonetheless, the news of de-escalation between the United States and Iran has led to a fall in commodities prices, including a fall in the price of oil. President Trump himself now continues to talk about coming to some kind of a deal with Iran. And as a number of people are pointing out, for the time being at least, President Trump seems to be talking only about the nuclear issue. He talks always about commitments from Iran not to develop a nuclear bomb, nuclear weapons. But of course, the Iranians have many times given those commitments. They will say that in 2015 they agreed the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action with the Obama administration and other governments, and it was Donald Trump himself who walked away from it. So if that is all that President Trump wants to achieve, and that's what he proposes, and what if Iran agrees to, he will accept as an off-ramp, then we'll simply have come full circle and we'll be exactly back where we were, with an agreement that President Trump denounced and eventually walked away from. I am sure, in fact, that the United States is going to raise more demands. Probably it will insist, as it has done in the past, on the ending of all Iranian nuclear enrichment. There are possible ways around this. Iran could conduct nuclear enrichment, but it might agree to conduct it on the territory of another country, Russia, for example. That idea has been floated in the past. Whether the United States, President Trump, is interested in any of that, we shall see. For the record, the preparations on each side for the war that each side appears to be preparing for continue. There are more reports of more American forces concentrating in the Middle East. and there are more reports of the Iranians preparing their own countermeasures. Specifically, they seem to be taking steps to conceal or make more difficult to observe various strategic sites across their country by satellites, by putting special netting and tents and things of that kind, and presumably paints and things, which will make it more difficult for the Americans to keep track of what is actually happening in these installations. I'm sure there's an awful lot more going on that we don't know yet about. My own view remains that having concentrated this enormous force against Iran, sooner or later, some kind of an American strike will take place. I'm not going to try to give the time or the date or speculate about those sort of things. All I will say is that I still sense that the balance is very, very strongly towards war, and that nothing I've seen up to now leads me to change that view. Anyway, that is all I'm going to say about the situation with respect to Iran in today's program. Today, I intend to focus instead on the perennial topic of these programs, which is the conflict in Ukraine. It seems to me that events in Ukraine continue to move faster than many people understand or want to understand. And, well, actually, there's been quite a lot of news about the situation in Ukraine. And perhaps I will start with the 7-day energy ceasefire, the one that President Trump, to the seething anger of the Russians, announced last week, which had apparently been agreed through an exchange of written messages between President Trump and President Putin over the course of the last week. The one which I am sure the Russians had not intended should be made public at all, and the one which President Zelensky of Ukraine was not told about. I think I can make all of these points about this energy truce with a fair amount of confidence as to their truth. Anyway, Zelensky this morning said that so far over the last 24 hours, the Russians have not conducted any strikes against Ukraine's energy system. The Russians, by contrast, are talking, or in some respects not talking, about this energy truce, which points in a diametrically different direction. Putin's spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, was asked about the energy truce. He said that he had nothing more to say beyond what he had said previously. Now, previously he said that the energy truce would expire on the 1st of February. We're now, of course, on the 2nd of February. I take Peskov's words as confirmation that the energy truce is indeed, from a Russian point of view, over. Now, last night, there was, as it happens, a significant up-ramp in drone attacks by the Russians across Ukraine. I believe that the number of drones that the Russians launched and which conducted strikes against Ukraine was roughly double what it had been over the previous night. Moreover, there is some reason to think, though the reports so far are sketchy, that some of these drones did indeed attack energy facilities, Ukrainian energy facilities in eastern Ukraine, though the full information has not yet been provided. The Russians do continue to conduct missile strikes with Iskander missiles, but mostly, so far as I can tell, over the last 24 hours, these have been focused on Ukrainian military targets. It's gone almost entirely unreported over the last few weeks. But over the last 2 weeks in particular, the Russians claim to have hunted down and destroyed large numbers of HIMARS launchers in eastern Ukraine, particularly northeastern Ukraine, where the HIMARS launchers have been used to attack the Russian city of Belgorod. So there have been, according to the Russians, and they provided footage which appears to confirm this, there's been a large number of Iskander strikes against these HIMARS launchers. I can remember back in 2022 when the HIMARS was first deployed to Ukraine. Firstly, at that time, it was touted as another wonder weapon that would change the entire direction of the war. It did cause the Russians some problems for about 2 months, though the Russians quickly adjusted to its arrival and showed soon after that they had the means to jam it. That's another story. But anyway, I can also remember how there were many denials that the Russians had managed to attack or destroy any HIMARS systems, any HIMARS launchers at all. And those denials, as I remember, persisted for about a year. One doesn't hear these denials any longer. Clearly, the Russians are able to track and destroy HIMARS launchers, and they're doing this on a regular and indeed intensifying basis. And the Russians, of course, have also continued to attack railway lines. There were more pictures last night of Ukrainian trains coming under attack from Russian drones, logistics trains. And tragically, there was also an attack on a coal mine, and a vehicle carrying coal miners also seems to have been attacked. And according to the Western media, at least 12 of these coal miners, Ukrainian coal miners, was killed over the course of this attack as well. Coal mines, of course, it's worth remembering, are energy producing facilities as well, though they're also used in the steel industry, though I wonder whether, given all the many other problems, the steel industry in Ukraine is functioning at any significant level at the present time. Anyway, all of that is going on. The Russian strikes, as I said, continue. And there's also been movement on the front lines. And again, there is a huge amount of misrepresentation of the pace of the Russian advance. Some calculations have been made, and they suggest that over the course of January, the Russians advanced by around 580, captured around 580 square kilometers of formerly Ukrainian-controlled territory. This matches fairly closely a figure of 500 square kilometers that Gerasimov, the Russian overall commander, gave some days before the end of January. Perhaps more important is that the pace of Russian advance this January 2026, has been twice as fast as it was in January 2025, and the pace of Russian advance in January 2025 was twice as fast as it had been in the previous year, January 2024. So we can see that the pace that the Russians are moving forward has been steadily growing. This was true during the various summer offensives in 2024 and 2025. The summer offensive of 2025 gained more territory, more cities, more important cities, bringing the Russians closer to the point where the Battle of Donbass had ended, and creating a major military crisis for Ukraine in Zaporozhye. More about that soon. Anyway, it moved significantly faster than the Russian summer offensive of 2024 did, and there's every reason to think that the summer 2026 offensive is going to move faster still. And that is what you would expect. The Russian army is getting bigger and stronger. The Ukrainian army is getting smaller and less experienced and is becoming overextended and is becoming increasingly short of essential supplies. Now, here I would like to take head on a particular narrative trope that you regularly see in the media in the West today. The point is often made that it has taken the Russians longer to capture Donbass and Zaporozhye and the four regions than it took the Russians to reach Berlin during the Second World War. The war on the Eastern Front between 1941 and 1945 lasted 4 years, and we are about to start the 5th year of the special military operation. That parallel is absurd. The Second World War cost the Soviet Union 27 million people killed. The level of violence and the intensity of fighting was on a scale unparalleled in modern history. It far dwarfed anything that we are seeing in the war that has been played out in Ukraine. And to get a sense of the difference between total war and the kind of limited war that the Russians have been fighting over the period of the special military operation. Well, it seems to me that one single statistic basically tells it all. By 1944, Germany was devoting around 75% of its GDP to military and military-related matters. The United States, also in 1944, committed around 40% of its GDP to military or military-related matters. There is some discussion as to what proportion of Russia's GDP is being used to support the Russian military, only part of which, by the way, is committed to the special military operation. The best estimates are between 6 and 7%. So there is no valid comparison to be made between a total war, such as was fought during the Second World War, and the kind of far more limited military operation that the Russians are engaging in Ukraine and have been doing over the last 4 years. The wars, the types of wars, are entirely different. And for the record, if we put aside these false comparisons of the Second World War and indeed the First World War and look at other wars in general, well, many wars, in fact, most wars probably last longer than 4 years. The Vietnam War lasted significantly longer than 4 years. The United States started to send large numbers of troops to South Vietnam in 1965. It began to draw them down in the early 1970s. I think I'm right in saying that the American withdrawal was completed in 1973, which would mean that the American presence in South Vietnam lasted twice as long as the Russian presence in Ukraine. And of course, the United States did not achieve its objectives in that war, whereas the Russians continued to advance. Other wars have lasted longer still. The American intervention in Afghanistan lasted 20 years. The Russian intervention, the Soviet intervention in Afghanistan in the 1980s lasted from memory around 8 years. And of course, if we're talking about other smaller wars, the colonial wars, all of those kind of wars, wars that have been fought in Europe, wars that the Russians, by the way, have fought in the Caucasus, both the recent Chechen wars, earlier wars, well, those two have often lasted much longer than 4 years. Those of us who study wars and are familiar with wars know that it is the intensity and violence of wars that differs from one war to another, and the duration of a particular war is dependent on all sorts of political and economic factors, and sometimes a great power like Britain, France, the United States, and Russia will fight longer wars as opposed to shorter wars because they will not want to disturb domestic stability. They will not want to commit a total mobilization of resources to ending those wars quicker, because whatever political importance is attached to those wars, there are doubts about whether society can be mobilized to fight them in that sort of way. In terms of this war, in terms of the amount of military support, military, economic, and financial support the Ukrainians have received from the West, in terms of the balance of forces and the amount of resources that the Russians have committed, well, I wouldn't actually say that 4 years is extraordinarily long. Anyway, that's my view. Others no doubt can push back, but I think that what I have just said is historically founded. Anyway, the Russian tempo of advance is faster this winter than it was last winter, and it was faster last winter than it was the winter before, and the same, as I said, is likely to be true in terms of the tempo of the Russian military advance this summer. I think it is highly likely, almost certainly the case, in fact, that over the course of this year, Ukrainian resistance in Donbass will have collapsed, and there is a high probability that Ukrainian resistance in Zaporozhye region will collapse also. If we start with Zaporozhye region, the Russians continue to advance westwards towards Zaporozhye city from Gulyapolye and other positions in eastern Zaporozhye, which they have now captured. And the Russians continue to advance both eastwards from western Zaporozhye, where they've already now established strong positions, and northwards incrementally towards the city of Zaporozhye as well. There have been more reports of further Russian advances in this area over the last 24 hours. And the biggest battle that seems to be taking place at the moment continues to be Konstantinovka, which is in Donbass, which is an important town, the southern town of the Slavyansk-Kramatorsk conurbation. The fighting in Konstantinovka continues to grow in intensity. The Russian advance in Konstantinovka continues, with more and more of the town falling under Russian control. This morning, the Russians confirmed that a village called Sukhetskoye, which is located to the west of Konstantinovka, has been captured, which strengthens Russian positions on the western flank of Konstantinovka. Konstantinovka is almost surrounded. There is only one point where the Ukrainians can still send supplies from, and that is the north. That is heavily covered by Russian drones. There are lots of pictures of destroyed Ukrainian vehicles there. Konstantinovka is in low ground. The Russians control all the high ground. Nobody, I think, questions the direction of this battle. And by the end of this month, I think it is very likely going to prove to be the case. In fact, almost a certainty that Konstantinovka will have passed entirely under Russian control. And elsewhere, further north, the Russians continue to advance closer to Slavyansk and Kramatorsk. They are now moving closer to the important village of Rai Alexandrovka, which is located to the east of Slavyansk, and also, incidentally, to the power station, the Slavyansk power station, which is also located in a different place east of Slavyansk. And the Russians have also tightened further their grip on Liman, and according to Radovka, the major resistance by the Ukrainians in Liman is in the southeastern part of the town, and the Ukrainians there, as I've discussed in previous programs, are close to being surrounded. Once the winter ends, the Russians are going to be in very strong positions around the key remaining cities that are their proximate targets in the special military operation: Zaporozhye, Slavyansk, and Kramatorsk. We will likely see major attempts to surround Slavyansk and Kramatorsk begin in the spring, and it's likely that by the summer both of these towns will indeed be surrounded, and that the other much smaller town called Dobropilye in northwestern Donbass will have fallen, and it is also likely by late spring to summer, early summer, that the battle, the siege of Zaporozhye city, the biggest city in eastern Ukraine, which the Russians will have attacked up to this time, that the siege of Zaporozhye city will at that point have begun. So the pressure continues and grows all the time, and of course it is taking place even as the economic system in Ukraine rapidly breaks down, even as funding from Europe continues to move slowly and reach Ukraine in dribs and drabs, and even as the Russians tighten their grip in the war in the sky and continue to inflict damage on Ukraine's railways, on its road systems, on its energy system as well, continuing their process of grinding Ukraine down. I think a further point I'm going to quickly say is that in one essential respect, the war in Ukraine is different from every other that has been fought since the Second World War. Ukraine is an industrialized European country. It has European-style cities. In fact, it has European cities. It has the access to all of the technologies and industries that European society and Western societies have. And of course, before the war, it had very, very significant and very large armed forces. There's never been a war fought against a country like this, of this size, and it's worth remembering that Ukraine is the second biggest country in Europe after Russia itself. There's never been a war fought between two countries like Russia and Ukraine before at any point since the end of the Second World War. It's a little bit like trying to imagine a war between, say, Germany and Poland today. And, well, it's difficult to know how such a war would play out, and I don't want to speculate about these things. But that fact also makes this war different from other wars, and again explains some of its peculiarities. And given that reality, we can also see why it's played out in the way that it has, and why, in terms of Ukraine and Ukrainian society, it is proving to be so destructive. Anyway, let's press on, because there's going to be, or so we're told, another meeting of the Working Party on the 4th of February, the 4th and 5th of February. I discussed in my program yesterday how unhappy, how unwilling Zelensky has been to have this Working Party convene again. There continues to be, in other words, some kind of diplomacy taking place alongside the diplomacy that we have already seen. But as I discussed in my program yesterday, it's unlikely, it is all but inconceivable that that diplomacy is going to make any progress, because the Russians have not modified or watered down any of their demands, contrary to what some people assume. And Zelensky himself, who continues to be Ukraine's president and who continues to have the support of a critical mass of the political class in Kiev, he too is not willing to make any concessions, even up to agreeing to withdraw Ukrainian troops from Donbass. So given that this is so, a continuation of the war, despite the diplomacy, is certain. It is inevitably going to continue. Now, there have been suggestions that the Europeans over the last few weeks might be interested in resuming some kind of dialogue with the Russians. Back in December, Meloni and Macron spoke about the importance of appointing some sort of chief negotiator to reach out and talk to the Russians. I pointed out that there is no sign that they have agreed on any such person. And the fact that the negotiations, if they were to take place, would go nowhere is, to my mind, confirmed by an extraordinary interview that has been given to the French media by the French Foreign Minister Barrot. So he was asked, did you notice any change in the position of the Russian president? And Barrot replied, at this stage, Vladimir Putin shows no sign of real readiness to move towards peace. The war in Ukraine discredits the Russian nation, risking erasing it from history. It's high time for Putin to abandon his claims and finally agree to a ceasefire. And then the next question was, Macron mentioned the possibility of resuming dialogue with Vladimir Putin. Are these conditions to start talking? Are the conditions to start talking with him again? And Barrot replied, France has never in principle ruled out the possibility of an exchange with Russia in full transparency with Ukraine and its European partners, and provided, of course, that it would be useful. Now, where is there the slightest hint there that France, that the French foreign minister, that Macron, who appoints the French foreign minister, is generally interested in dialogue with Moscow. We're told that the Russians, because they support the war, risk being erased from history. What does that even mean? Personally, I find that an incredibly chilling expression. I mean, it's not just insulting, it's massively threatening as well. And when asked about negotiations, we're told, oh, well, we've never ruled out negotiations with the Russians, but it must all be agreed with Ukraine and with our European partners, who must logically include people like Kaja Kallas and the Estonian leadership and the other Baltic leaderships and the Swedes and the British and all of those people who are dead set against dialogue with the Russians. And of course, it can only happen if the Russians agree to European demands. There's only any point in it if it would be useful, and what Putin must do to make it useful is finally agree to a ceasefire. In other words, accept the ending of the conflict on Ukrainian and Western terms. Now those are not comments that speak of any genuine, sincere willingness to begin negotiations. There is no hint here of any recognition that the war has been an absolute and complete disaster for Europe, that it's also been a complete disaster for Ukraine, and that the time has come, therefore, to meet with the Russians to see whether something can be discussed in order to move forward and to come to a resolution which will end this conflict and restore peace, not just to Ukraine, but to Europe. If you read Barrot's comments, it's absolutely clear that he remains as hardline, as intransigent as always. And I get the sense the same is true of pretty much all of the major European governments. Macron sometimes dithers, sometimes he gives the impression that he does want to negotiate with the Russians, but at other times, and in fact much more of the time, he talks in very threatening terms about deploying French troops or French and British troops or European troops to Ukraine. He talks about taking measures against the Russians, as I discussed yesterday in my program. His military recently seized a merchant ship in the Mediterranean, which they believed was Russian, only it turned out it wasn't, and therefore had to be released. So Macron talks in that way from time to time, but the other European leaders, the other key European countries, Britain and Germany, show no such interest. Merz shows no interest in conducting a dialogue with the Russians whatsoever. The British have publicly argued against such a dialogue, and, well, maybe some of the Mediterranean countries, Italy and Spain, would be open to it, but as anyone who has followed European politics closely knows, it is the big countries in northwest Europe, Britain, France, Germany, the Dutch and Belgians, the Scandinavian governments, the Poles and the Balts. It is they who are running the policy for the moment and who are making the decisions. And the decision remains no negotiations, no discussions with the Russians. The Russians must accept our terms. Unless they do, our support for Ukraine continues, even if we are not able, in fact, to provide much in the way of support for Ukraine. And in fact, On the last point, see the next set of comments that Barrot made in this interview. Does France have the means to really help Ukraine until the war ends? And the Barrot responded, at France's initiative, the European Union allocated a loan of 90 billion euros to Ukraine. France once again signalled its intention to increase pressure on Russia. 90 billion euros, most of which will be provided or at least secured through an implicit German guarantee. The 90 billion euro loan that Barrot is talking about is not a straight transfer of money from France or any EU state to Ukraine. It is going to be, as I've discussed in many programs, raised in the way of a loan floated on the international financial markets. So there's not going to be any provision of aid from any European taxpayer, at least not in the short term. In the long term, there certainly will be, but not in the short term. And of course, Barrot does not talk about military supplies, weapon systems, even Mirage jets or anything of that kind. So he's asked the question, does France have the means to really help Ukraine until the war ends? And his response to that is entirely evasive. It is evasive because the reality is that France cannot, and Germany cannot, and Britain cannot. None of them can. Not one of these countries, either separately or taken together, can provide Ukraine with the resources and the means it needs to continue the war, either by themselves or collectively. In fact, since Mark Rutte recently said that it's absolute fantasy for the European members of NATO to think that they can go it alone without the United States, that it's not happening, that it is impossible. There's been actually a raft of articles and commentaries across the European media and from European officials that effectively say the same thing. Europe currently, in its current economic, industrial, technological configuration, with its societies unable and unprepared to support long wars, is in no condition, in no position to sustain a long-term, long-duration conflict with a great power like Russia without the help of the United States, and it certainly cannot help Ukraine without the United States. The 90 billion euro loan that Barrot is talking about has not yet been floated on the international financial markets. There are still disagreements within Europe about this loan. I've already discussed that there are major problems with this loan altogether, given that repayment of it is premised on the Russians agreeing to pay reparations, something which, of course, they will never do. So the 90 billion euro loan that Barrot is talking about at the present time does not even exist. It's something that the European leaders have agreed amongst themselves, but which they have failed to put into action. And perhaps, conceivably, they might not even be able to. So that is the reality. And yet, despite that reality, they continue to say, no talks, no substantive talks. It is for the Russians to accept our terms. It is for the Russians to capitulate. It is the Russians who are wrong. it is we who are in the right. If the Russians don't agree, well, we will continue to resist them and we will pretend that they are no longer there, that they're no longer part of the European family, because that presumably is what Monsieur Barrot means when he talks about Russia being erased from history. I found this one of the most appalling, one of the most depressing, one of the most shocking interviews a European official has given since the start of this conflict. I find it horrifying that comments like this could be made by the foreign minister of France 4 years into a war which Europe cannot sustain, in the middle of a crisis, an economic and social crisis that is affecting to a greater or lesser extent every nation of Europe. I find it appalling that he could speak that way. As foreign minister, he ought to be the person engaging in diplomacy. Previous great French foreign ministers in the past, Talleyrand, for example, would have been horrified to hear a French foreign minister talk in this way, in this sort of situation. More recent French foreign ministers, like Dominique de Villepin, who, by the way, is still around and has become increasingly and openly critical of French policy, would be, and in fact in his case actually are, horrified as well. But if you want to see the authentic expression of European thinking, this interview, in my opinion, crystallizes it exactly. So the war will go on. I cannot see any other way. There will continue to be these meetings in Abu Dhabi. They will presumably continue for many months. They cannot not continue because the Americans are participating, and the Ukrainians, who would far rather not be there, are going to have to turn up, because refusing to turn up is going to be unacceptable to the Americans and might enrage them. And that is something the Ukrainians know they cannot risk and cannot afford. So these meetings will continue. There will continue to be sporadic meetings between Dmitriev and the Americans, such as the ones that have happened, the one that's just happened in Miami, where Dmitriev, for the first time, met a cabinet-level American official in the person of Scott Bessent to discuss the lifting of sanctions, or at least the partial lifting of sanctions, in order to enable the Russians to pay their entry fee to Donald Trump's Board of Peace, using the $1 billion and the $5 billion of Russian government assets frozen in the United States. Notice, by the way, that there's been no word or sign that Scott Bessent agreed or that the Americans are prepared to do that. Just saying. But anyway, these sporadic negotiations will continue. But it is the war, the situation on the ground, which, as always, will determine the outcome. In my opinion, looking back, there was only one brief moment after the start of the special military operation where a negotiated solution looked like it might actually come. That was in April 2022, when the Istanbul Agreement was mostly agreed and initialed by both sides. The Ukrainians were persuaded by the Americans and the British and the other European states to pull back from that. There are legitimate grounds to doubt that Zelensky himself was really committed to the implementation of this proposal. But anyway, regardless of that, at no point since has there been any serious wish or desire to pursue negotiations to try to find a real diplomatic solution to this war. So that then leaves us to go back again to what the outcome of this war is going to be, how it ends. Now, I have been reading Russian comments made by Russian officials. And I mentioned in several programs now the huge interview that the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov gave to the Turkish media, which was published on the 29th of January. The interview in which Lavrov again reiterated that the Russians have not agreed to Ukraine receiving any security guarantees of the sort that have been discussed in the West, and that the Russian demands have not changed. The thing that came away to me, perhaps even more strongly from that interview, is Lavrov's loathing and disgust of Zelensky and of the entire political setup in Kiev. I don't think it is too strong a word to say that he hates them. And Medvedev has talked in the same way. Now, Medvedev has given a rare interview to a group of media outlets, which include the British news agency Reuters. He has been more moderate in his language than he often is, though apparently hanging behind him on the wall of his office, he prominently placed a cartoon of himself firing a machine gun at Europe's leaders. So you can take from that what you will. But anyway, there he was. He spoke about his willingness, if he ever became president of Russia again, to use nuclear weapons if the fate of Russia were once again in his hands and Russia faced the kind of existential risks that would justify use of nuclear weapons. He pointed out that this must also be true of the leaders of all of the other nuclear powers. He spoke about AI, and he said that Russia is indeed heavily committed to AI and that it is indeed in the race for AI. And I noticed that Wolfgang Munchau, on Unheard, acknowledged that Russia, with its enormous energy resources, and I would add also with its tremendous intellectual and engineering skills, must also be considered a strong candidate amongst the countries that are likely to succeed with AI. And, well, Medvedev talked about that, but of course he also talked about the war, and though his language was pretty moderate by his standards, it seemed to me that it was as tough as ever. And Medvedev has also been talking much more forthrightly, as he tends to do, on his Telegram and X platforms. And he makes it clear that he shares his loathing and the loathing and disgust that Lavrov has for Zelensky and for the entire political setup in Kiev also. My own view, and it is my view, is that the Russians absolutely will continue this process of negotiations with the Americans. They probably see it as being in their interests to do so. It keeps the Americans busy and it prevents the Americans from swinging back towards absolute support for Ukraine and renewing their commitment to Ukraine. And along the way, that causes disagreement between the United States and its European allies. It causes doubt and uncertainty in Ukraine itself. And it also perhaps provides a very limited restraint on the American side against further escalation. So from a Russian point of view, some of their officials are tied up in long conversations in Abu Dhabi and other places. But on balance, it's probably better to have these conversations than not. And it may be, especially as the military crisis in Ukraine deepens, it may be that as the Russian army advances to capture Zaporozhye city, or even advances towards Kiev itself, given the mood of panic and crisis that there is going to be in the West at that point, it might be better and wiser for the Russians to have contact with the Americans in those sort of scenarios than not. But again, I have to say, reading Lavrov, reading Medvedev, listening to what they say, listening to what other Russian officials say, I cannot avoid the conclusion that what the Russians really want to achieve in Ukraine is regime change. They won't say it straightforwardly, or at least they've said it in the past, but only briefly and without saying it in too much detail, spelling it out in too much detail, because Russia's entire policy over the last 30 years has been to oppose regime change, to insist that it is sovereign countries, sovereign nations that have the right to determine their own future, and that it is not for outsiders to dictate that future for them or to dictate their form of government. So for the Russians to come out straightforwardly and say that they want regime change in Kiev, that they want to replace the current government in Kiev with a government more friendly to themselves, that is something that, for the moment at least, the Russians are not willing to do. But reading what Medvedev has to say, including to Reuters, reading what Lavrov is saying, reading what other Russian officials are saying as well, I can't help but say that whatever future Ukraine may have, if it is up to the Russians, up to the leadership in Moscow, and here I am sure that one must include Putin himself, then that future must be one without Vladimir Zelensky or any of the people associated with him. There must be a complete change of the political system in Kiev. Now, I don't know whether that is understood in the United States. I doubt that it is, by the way. I think that President Trump still imagines that he can bring Zelensky and Putin together in some form, or at least persuade the Russians to compromise. But even as the war is likely to continue, I think that always the Russians have the idea of regime change in Kiev at the back of their mind. And if we start to see places like Zaporozhye fall, and if we see Donbass also fall, then frankly, as the war probably continues beyond that, because as the Russians have been careful to point out, their demands do not end with Donbass or Zaporozhye, or even Donbass, Zaporozhye and Kherson region. They also want status for the Russian language, protection for the Orthodox Church, commitments, long-term commitments from Ukraine that it will end its tilt towards the West and will abandon its drive for NATO membership, or that it will also agree to demilitarize, things which no Ukrainian official that I'm aware of would be prepared to concede. After the fall of Donbass, after the fall of Zaporozhye, which are likely to happen this year. In fact, I'd say they're almost inevitably going to happen this year. My guess is that the idea of regime change in Kiev is going to move from the back of the Russians' mind to the forefront of the Russians' mind. And there will come a point that when the Russians will say that peace with Zelensky is impossible and that the only way to achieve peace is to remove him. So that, I think, is the direction where things are going. There are, of course, other things that could be discussed about a Russian victory, about where the Russians will stop in their advance westwards. But what I cannot imagine, even now, that the Russians do not want to see, and that is a Kiev with a government friendly to Moscow. Behind everything, at the back of everybody's mind in Moscow, that now is the central objective. Anyway, there we go. That's my overall take of the situation. In Ukraine, of course, they talk differently. There, mostly, it is all defiance. But a Ukrainian official, Governor Kim of Nikolaev region, who, by the way, played a significant role in the war in 2022 when the Russians held the city of Kherson, and it seemed for a time as if the Russians might advance from Kherson city and try to capture Nikolaev city as well, and Kim is the governor of Nikolaev. Anyway, Kim has given an interview to the Daily Telegraph, I believe, in which he says Ukraine is exhausted, that there must be an end to the war, that it cannot continue for much longer, that Ukraine is being ground down. He did say that the situation in Russia economically is also bad, but that's his opinion about Russia, a country he can hardly know much about by now. About Ukraine, he is absolutely clear that the situation is now desperate and unsustainable and simply cannot go on. Kim, back in 2022, was all defiance. Now he begs for peace. But of course, he is in faraway Nikolaev. He is not in Kiev, at the center of power. And what actual influence he has, I strongly doubt. And besides, what's probably making him nervous is that the Russians are edging closer and closer to Zaporozhye city. And he knows, I'm sure he knows, that if Zaporozhye city falls, then the way is open for the Russians to advance further west towards Odessa and, of course, Nikolaev as well. So he wants peace. He wants an end to the war. He doesn't outline what sort of things Ukraine must do to achieve an end to the war. He doesn't talk about a retreat from Donbass. He doesn't talk about agreeing to stay out of NATO. He is not prepared, at least in public, to talk about those things. He probably knows that if he did, Zelensky would instantly sack him from his position as governor of Nikolaev. So even though Kim, and I'm sure many other people in Ukraine, Budana for example, can see that the writing is on the wall, they won't express it. So the war will continue. There is no prospect for a peace agreement. The working party meetings will continue. They might eventually lead to something. And the fact that there is a dialogue about Ukraine, primarily now between the Americans and the Russians, in itself is a good thing. But my own view is that the direction of travel is clear. The Russians will clear Donbass this year. They will at least try to finish Zaporozhye this year also. Beyond that, the objective will be regime change in Kiev. That is where events are leading us towards. And it will be the first big regime change achieved in a war in a country the size of Ukraine, in Europe, through a war of this sort since the end of the Second World War. And it will be the first time that there's been that kind of regime change since the end of the Cold War. And, well, I do wonder how the Europeans, how people like the French Foreign Minister, Monsieur Barrot, will feel when it happens. I suspect that this is when the full extent of the crisis will finally hit home. But anyway, we see that, for the moment at least, Monsieur Barrot, like other European leaders, prefers to retreat into his own illusions. Anyway, that's my rather somber take of the situation as February begins. To repeat again, the Russian advance this winter has been faster than last winter, and last winter's advance was faster than in 2024. The Russians have now reached the last big, strong defense line in Donbass, and they will be at the gates of Zaporozhye city very soon, in a matter of months. And that will be the moment of crisis in the war. It's already downhill, but we are no longer going to be talking about the war going downhill for Ukraine in the West. Beyond Donbass and Zaporozhye, what will be opening up will be the abyss. Now, I'm going to finish today's program by talking about the Jeffrey Epstein affair. I've tended to avoid using his name because, well, there are some sensitivities on the part of the platform that I've noticed. But the American government has now released around 3 million documents, and I think it is stretching the point to absurdity now to avoid mentioning him by name. Anyway, these documents are still in the process of being digested and understood. I'm going to say straight away that, so far as I can see, they answer none of the key questions about Epstein. They don't explain where his money ultimately came from or how he was able to afford the impossibly extravagant lifestyle that he lived on the money he had. It is still extraordinary to me that he had so many contacts with so many people. He must have used pretty much all his day cultivating contacts with people, given the size of his network, and he can't have had much time for anything else, which of course begs further questions about where his money came from, or how he was able to afford the lifestyle that he did. Just saying. I think that one thing that has become extraordinarily clear, absolutely clear, over the last couple of weeks actually, is that along with the United States, one major area of operations for Jeffrey Epstein was Britain. We've had the further fall of Peter Mandelson, perhaps the single most pivotal member of the Labour Party's political leadership in Britain since the mid-1980s. He's now had to leave the Labour Party. There is talk that he might have to give evidence to Congress. There are reports in the British media this morning that Mandelson provided Epstein with what one must assume were confidential reports provided to the British Prime Minister, in this case Gordon Brown, talking about the financial situation in the immediate aftermath of the great financial crisis of 2008. So Britain is deeply implicated. The sections of the British establishment seem to be deeply enmeshed with Epstein. We've had many more revelations about the King's brother, Andrew, the former prince, and I suspect that more of that is coming. The extent of Epstein's network continues to astonish me, even though I suspect that he exaggerated it. If you read some of these documents that appear, you would get the impression that he was on first name terms with Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping. For the record, I don't believe he ever actually met these people. And there's a bizarre story in the British media today, the Daily Mail to be precise, that Epstein was some kind of Russian spy running some kind of honeypot operation for the Kremlin. The Daily Mail, however, admits that there isn't a single scintilla of documentary evidence that supports that conclusion, and it is in fact on its face totally absurd. If there had been anything of that kind, if there any reason to think that, then it is inconceivable over the course of the Epstein scandal that no one would have mentioned it before this point. And besides, earlier on, a few weeks ago, other emails and documents of Epstein appeared, which suggested that Epstein was trying to arrange a meeting with the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov and meetings with other Russian officials in order, as he put it, to provide them with the information he had about the man who is currently President of the United States, Donald Trump. Why would Epstein need to do that? Why would he need to approach the Russians in that way if he was actually working for them? As I said, the whole idea is actually absurd. I think that there is a lot about the British angle in Epstein's story that remains to be explained. I'm not saying it's the only angle or even the most important one, but certainly those stories are there and they do exist. But overall, he remains for me as much of a mystery as he always did. There is some hints, well, there are more than hints. There's bits and pieces of evidence that do, as far as I am concerned, lend very, very strong credence to the allegation of trafficking. This has been heatedly denied by some people, but there does seem to be some evidence in the emails that he was putting people in touch with each other, introducing some of his friends to young women in ways that do suggest trafficking to me, though I want to stress I don't know the full details. But anyway, the ultimate question of who he was, why he had this extraordinary reach, why he had all this wealth, why he had all of this apparent power, none of this so far has been explained. And so far as I can see, this enormous document dump, 3 million documents, doesn't explain it. He remains as mysterious and as unexplained as ever. Maybe one day all of these investigations, the one carried out by Congress, others that might be promised in future, they might provide us with these explanations in time. But for the moment, I don't think anything that we've seen does. And unless we are provided these explanations, I think many of us are going to feel that there are things about the way that the modern world works which we are not told about and which continue to be kept from us. Anyway, that's what I'm going to say about this up to this time. No doubt there'll be more studies of these documents over the next few weeks. Perhaps more revelations will come. But for me, this remains as much of a riddle as always. Anyway, this is where I'm going to finish my program today. Let me remind you once more that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop, links under this video. Last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.